You were always a placeholder, Seraphine, a warm body until something worthy of a crown arrived. Corvain's voice carried through the half-open door of the war room, and the bond between them, the sacred thread that had bound her soul to his since the night he first marked her, snapped so violently that she pressed a hand to her sternum and felt nothing but a scream where her heart should have been. She did not fall. She wanted to. Her knees begged for the floor, and the cold stone would have welcomed her. But she stood in the corridor of Hyphen Keep with her spine locked straight and her breath thin as winter, and she listened. Because there was more. There was always more when a man decided you were furniture. The people love her, a second voice purred, silk over a blade, and Seraphine knew that voice belonged to Lisa of the Silvered Veil, the high-born she-wolf who had arrived 3 moons ago with a retinue and a smile like a closing trap. They will love me more once the second mark is done. And then Corvain laughed, low and pleased, the laugh she had once thought belonged to her alone, and he said the words that turned her grief into something colder and far more useful. It is already done. She wears my scent and my seal, and she carries my air. Seraphine will understand. She has always understood her place. Seraphine didn't understand her place. That was the lie he had built his comfort upon. She stood in the shadow of the tapestry that showed his ancestors bringing the northern packs to heel, and she watched through the gap in the door as Lysa turned, bearing the curve of her shoulder, and there it lay, the second mating mark, silver bright and swollen and new, burned into the skin of another woman by the fangs of the man who had sworn before the moon that Seraphine would be his only bonded until the last of his days. A mate could mark twice. The old law allowed it for kings who needed alliances, needed heirs, needed blood other than their own to cement a throne. But no true bonded pair survived it whole, because the second mark didn't add. It replaced. It severed the first thread to make room for the new, and Seraphine felt that severing now, a phantom wound blooming hot across her own shoulder where his teeth had once claimed her, a burning that had no blood and no cure. She had felt his joy through that bond an hour ago. Now she felt only the raw, cauterized silence of a limb amputated in her sleep. She did not scream. That was the first decision, and it would shape everyone that followed. Screaming was what he expected of a placeholder, a wailing thing to be soothed and managed, and eventually pensioned off to some far cottage where discarded queens went to rot politely. She would give him no such performance. She stepped back from the door on silent feet, the way her grandmother had taught her to move through the birch woods of her girlhood, before the crown, before Corvain, before she had made the mistake of believing that love and power could share a bed. She walked the long gallery with its cold torches and its watching portraits, and she let the pain crest and break inside her like a wave against a cliff, and by the time she reached the far stair, she had swallowed it whole. Her eyes were dry, her hands were steady, and somewhere beneath the wreckage of the woman she had been, something old and patient uncurled and opened its eyes. She had known. That was the thing that would have surprised Corvain most, had he bothered to look at her in the last months instead of past her. She had known for weeks that something was wrong. Not the specifics, not the mark, not the pregnancy paraded now like a war banner, but the shape of it, the cooling of him, the way his attention drifted to the Silvered Veil delegation, like water finding a lower place. She had felt the bond thinning long before it snapped, felt him withdraw his warmth from it a little more each night, until she lay beside a stranger, wearing her husband's face. And because Seraphine had learned early that hope was a luxury for people who could afford to be wrong, she had prepared. Quietly, methodically, in the manner of a woman who understood that the only person who would ever save her was herself. She climbed to the Queen's solar and let herself in and closed the door, and she did not light the lamp. Moonlight was enough. It fell across the great bed they had shared, across the wardrobe of silks he had gifted her, across the coffers of jewels meant to signal to visiting dignitaries that the Alpha King of Hyphen kept his mate in splendor. Splendor. She looked at it all with the clean, dispassionate eye of a woman taking inventory of a life that was already over. None of it was hers. It had all been given, and a gift given by a man like Corvain was never a gift at all but a leash with a jewel on the collar. She would take none of it. Let him find it exactly as he had left it, every ring in its velvet, every gown on its hook, the crown of the consort resting on its stand like a thing she had merely borrowed, and now, courteously, returned. She crossed to the window seat, knelt, and pried loose the panel she had loosened herself over many patient nights. Inside lay the only things in Hyphen Keep that truly belonged to her: a leather satchel, travelling clothes, plain and warm and unmarked by any crest, a purse of coin she had earned, not been given, coin from the medicines she had brewed and sold quietly through the old healer Maren to the villages beyond the walls, coin no king had ever counted or controlled, and a folded paper, sealed and worn soft from handling, that would matter more than anyone in that keep could possibly imagine. She held it a moment against her chest. Then she began to change her clothes. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the Queen was gone, and a traveller stood in her place, hooded and quiet, a satchel across her back and a walking stick in her hand. Seraphine paused at the threshold of the solar and looked back at the room one last time, at the bed, at the jewels, at the crown, at the whole gilded architecture of her captivity, and she felt the last thread of the old life fray and drop away. She thought of the second mark, silver and cruel on another woman's shoulder, and she thought of Corvain's laugh, and she made her vow not to the moon, who had watched him betray her and done nothing, but to herself, in the plain and durable voice of a woman who has run out of tears and found something harder beneath. "He thinks he has discarded a placeholder," she told the silence. "He will learn what he threw away when it is far too late to reach for it. And then he will beg, not for forgiveness, for survival." She turned and walked out, and didn't look back again, and the door closed behind her with a sound as final as a coffin lid. The servant's stair was cold and unlit, and she descended it by memory, past the sleeping levels of the keep, past the kitchens where the banked ovens breathed their last heat into the dark, down toward the postern gate where a single figure waited with a shuttered lantern held low. Maren. Old Maren, the healer who had come to Hyphen before Corvain's father wore the crown, who had brought Corvain himself into the world, and had watched him grow from a bright-eyed pup into a man who mistook cruelty for strength. She was bent now, her hair white as frost, her hands knotted with the ache of 70 winters, but her eyes, when she lifted the lantern, were as sharp and unclouded as a girl's. "So," she murmured, taking in the travelling clothes, the satchel, the set of Seraphine's jaw. "It is done, then. He has done the unforgivable thing." It was not a question, and Seraphine did not answer it as one. "You knew," she said instead, and the old woman's mouth twisted. "I smelled the Veil Witch's intentions the day she rode through that gate. I told him. He told me I was old and jealous, and that a queen's business was not a healer's concern." She spat delicately onto the stones. A healer's concern, as if I didn't stitch the wound when his mother miscarried and hold her hand while she wept. As if I do not know exactly what that second mark will do to this pack before the year is out. Seraphine reached for the postern bolt, but Maren's hand, dry and light as a bundle of twigs, closed over her wrist. Listen to me, girl, because I will not have another chance to say it. You think you leave here broken. You do not. You leave here free, and freedom is the only wealth that cannot be inherited or stolen, only chosen. Corvain will not understand what he has lost, because a man who counts a woman as furniture cannot grasp that furniture was holding up his roof. But you mustn't carry his blindness with you into the dark. Do not spend your years hating him. Spend them becoming so wholly yourself that when he finally sees you again, he will not recognize the woman he threw away, and that not recognizing will be the cruelest wound you could ever deal him. She pressed something into Seraphine's palm then, small and cool. A ring, but not one of Corvain's. A plain band of river silver, worked with the mark of the Healers' Guild, the one Maren herself had worn for 50 years. This will open doors in places that owe nothing to Hyphen. Guild law runs deeper than any crown. Use it well. Seraphine's composure, which had held through the corridor and the solar and the long descent, cracked at last, not into weeping but into something raw, a single sharp breath drawn against a lifetime of feeling unseen. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me? You could stay warm here for whatever years you have left. Helping me risks all of it." And Maren laughed, a dry rustle of a sound, and pushed the bolt back herself with a strength that belied her age. "Because I am old, and I have watched a great many powerful men mistake obedience for loyalty and silence for consent, and I have watched every one of them fall, and I am tired of standing at the graveside pretending to be surprised. Go, Seraphine. Take the eastern track past the mill and follow the river. There is a barge master at Coldwater Ford who owes me his son's life and asks no questions of a woman with guild silver on her finger. He will carry you to Marrowgate, and Marrowgate is a wide world, and a wide world has never yet failed to make room for a clever woman who wants nothing from it but the chance to work." The gate swung open on the night, on the cold, clean air that smelled of pine and river and freedom, and Seraphine stepped through it into the dark, and behind her the old healer whispered, so soft it might have been the wind, "Fly, little queen, fly and do not land until the ground is your own." The barge master asked her nothing, as promised, and the river carried her east through a country she had never seen from anywhere but a carriage window, with the curtains half drawn. She watched the banks slide by in the grey of dawn, willow and reed, and the smoke of waking villages, and she felt the phantom wound on her shoulder throb and then, slowly, over hours and then over days, begin to quiet. Not to heal. It would never fully heal. A severed, true bond left a scar on the soul that ached in cold weather for the rest of a wolf's life. But to quiet, to become a thing she carried rather than a thing that carried her. She did not weep on that barge. She thought. She planned. She took the folded paper from her satchel when she was certain the master was asleep, and she opened it and read again the words she had memorized long ago, and she smiled a smile that had nothing of warmth in it and everything of purpose. And then she folded it away again and watched the dawn come up over a world that had, for the first time in 6 years, no idea who she was. The keep behind her would wake soon. They would find the jewels untouched, and the crown returned, and the queen simply, impossibly, gone. And the world outside those walls remained entirely ignorant of what it had just been given. 6 months later, The trading city of Marrowgate ran on two things: the river that fed it, and the woman who had appeared from nowhere the previous spring, and within half a year made herself indispensable to both. They called her Wren. It was a small name, a plain brown bird's name, and she had chosen it precisely because it announced nothing and hid everything. Wren the healer, they said in the lower markets. Wren who could break a fever that the temple physicians had given up as fatal. Wren who knew which of the fenland herbs would stop a wound from souring, and which would send a man's heart racing into stillness. Wren who charged the wealthy triple and the poor nothing, and somehow made the arithmetic work. But it was not the healing alone that had lifted her. It was what she did with what the healing taught her. Because a healer, it turned out, went into every house. Into the merchant's counting room, and the widow's cold kitchen, and the harbour master's fever-sick chamber. And a clever healer with a still tongue and a patient ear learned the secret circulatory system of a city, the debts and the grudges and the shipments that arrived light, the marriages held together by mortgages, and the fortunes built on sand. Within 3 months, Wren had bought her first warehouse, a leaking ruin near the Watergate that everyone else had written off, and filled it with cured fenland herbs and river salt, and the pressed oils that the southern perfumers paid absurd sums for. Within 5, she owned 3 warehouses and a share in a barge line, and the merchants who had once patronized the strange plain woman with the gild ring now sought her counsel, and, increasingly, her permission. She was not rich yet, not in the way Corvain understood richness, with vaults and standing armies. But she was solvent, and she was clean, and every copper of it was hers, earned and untainted, and she had learned that the woman who controlled what a city needed held a subtler and more durable power than the woman who merely sat above it, wearing a crown. She rose before dawn each day and worked until the lamps were lit, and she slept without dreaming, and the phantom ache in her shoulder had become a familiar companion rather than an enemy, a reminder rather than a wound. She was not alone in the work. That was the second thing that had changed, though she guarded it more carefully than the warehouses. His name was Ambrose Kettering, and he was the master of the barge line she had bought into, a broad, unhurried man with river-grey eyes, and salt in his dark beard, and a way of listening that made a person feel, for once, entirely heard. He was not a wolf. He was human, ordinary, mortal, without a scrap of the old blood that Corvain and his kind wore like a birthright. And Seraphine found that she did not care in the slightest, that in fact his ordinariness was a kind of relief, because Ambrose valued her for none of the things the pack world had ever valued or discarded her for. He did not care that she had once worn a crown. He did not know it. He cared that she was clever, that she kept her word, that she noticed the tremor in a man's hands before the man himself did, that she could look at a ledger and see the lie hidden 3 columns deep. He respected her competence with a plainness that undid her more than any grand declaration could have, and when, one rainy evening, over cooling tea in the warehouse office, he had said simply, "I don't know who you were before Marrowgate, Wren, and I find I don't need to. Whoever she was, she made you, and you are the finest thing I have ever had the luck to stand beside." She had not been able to speak for a long moment, and the silence between them had said everything that mattered. It was Ambrose who first brought her the news from the West, though he did not know he was bringing it to the woman it concerned. He came in from the docks one grey afternoon, shaking the rain from his coat, and he said, "Word's up from the river traders. Something's rotten in the northern packs. High Fen, they're calling it. The old Alpha King's realm." Seraphine did not look up from her ledger, and only the sudden stillness of her pen betrayed her. "Rotten how?" she said, in Wren's mild voice. "Sickness in the bloodlines," Ambrose said, dropping into the chair across from her. "Blight in the northern grain, and talk, the ugly kind, that the king took a second mate against the old council, and the whole pack's been cursed for it. Miscarriages, a wasting in the young. The bonded pairs are sickening one by one, they say, as if the moon herself turned her face away. Half the western river's afraid to trade up there. I told the barge captains to hold our northern runs till it settles." He shook his head. "Bad business, whatever the truth of it. A land only rots like that from the top." Seraphine set down her pen very carefully. So it had begun, exactly as Maren had foreseen. The second mark had not strengthened Corvainen's line, it had poisoned it. A true bond broken by treachery did not simply release its wolf. It fouled the deep magic that held a pack whole, the invisible root system of loyalty and blood and moon-given order that a healer like Maren understood and a king like Corvain took for granted. Break the true bond of a reigning alpha through betrayal, spurn the mate the moon had chosen, and the sickness spread outward from that wound like rot from a bruised apple, into the grain and the wombs and the very bonds that made the pack a pack instead of a mob of wolves. She had known this in the abstract when she left. She had not let herself imagine it in the particular. Now, hearing it in Ambrose's plain and pitying voice, she felt not triumph, or not only triumph, but a strange grief for the innocent, for the mothers losing pups and the young wasting in their beds, none of whom had asked for their king's vanity. "The king," she said. "What of him?" Ambrose shrugged. "Failing, they say. His new queen's a beauty and a fool, and she's brought a pack of Silvered Vale nobles with her, who've their fingers in everything. There's a name folk whisper when they talk of who really runs Hyphen now. Not the king? A woman? Lisa's own kin. Ravenna of the Vale." Seraphine's stomach turned to cold iron. Ravenna. She had heard that name once, long ago, spoken low in a council she had not been meant to overhear, spoken as one speaks of a wolf that hunts other wolves. So Lysa had never been the true threat. Lysa had been the bait. And Corvain, poor, proud, blind Corvain, had swallowed the hook whole and dragged his entire kingdom down into the dark after him. Ambrose watched her face, and being a perceptive man, he saw more than she intended. "You know that country," he said quietly. It was not an accusation. Seraphine met his eyes, and for the first time did not deploy Wren's mild deflection. She was too tired of hiding, and he had earned the truth, or the shape of it. "I was born under those mountains," she said. "I left because a man there decided I was worth less than an alliance. I have not spoken of it, because speaking of it changes nothing." Ambrose was quiet a while. Then he said, "The barge captains want to abandon the northern trade entirely. Write off the debts, cut the roots, let Hyphen rot." He paused. "But you're not going to let them, are you? I can see it. You've that look you get before you buy a warehouse everyone else thinks is worthless." And Seraphine, who had spent 6 months becoming a woman who wanted nothing from the world but the chance to work, felt the old patient thing uncurl behind her ribs and open its eyes wider than it had since the night she walked out of Hyphen Keep. Because a rotting kingdom was a kingdom whose debts came cheap, whose grain contracts and river tolls and shipping charters could be bought for pennies by anyone with the coin and the nerve, and Seraphine had spent 6 months quietly acquiring both. She did not want revenge. Revenge was loud and cheap, and it burned out fast. She wanted something far colder and far more complete. She wanted to own the ground he stood on before he ever knew she had returned. The strategy took shape over the following weeks, the way a hard frost takes a river, quietly, from the edges inward, until one morning the whole thing has set solid and there is no undoing it. Seraphine did not ride north with a banner. She did not send a letter or an emissary or any signal at all that would reach Corvain's collapsing court. She stayed in Marrowgate, in the warehouse office, with its rain-streaked window and its cold tea, and she used the one weapon that a dying kingdom cannot defend against. She bought its debts. Hyphen was rotting from within, and a rotting realm bleeds money the way a wound bleeds heat. The northern grain had failed. That meant Hyphen must buy grain from the south, on credit, at ruinous rates, and the men who held that credit were merchants of the river cities who were terrified of the blight-cursed north and desperate to be rid of the paper. Seraphine bought it from them at a discount, quietly, through 3 separate factors so that no single name appeared too often. She bought the shipping charters that let Hyphen's remaining goods reach market. She bought the tolls on the mountain river passes, leased out decades ago by Corvain's careless father, and traded down through a dozen hands until they surfaced, dusty and forgotten, in a broker's backroom ledger, where only a woman who had once read every document in the keep's archive would think to look for them. That was the neglected paperwork, the open loop she had planted in her own mind 6 years ago, and never spoken of. As queen, bored and unseen and hungry for something to do with a mind no one wanted to use, Seraphine had read the entire legal history of Hyphen. Every charter, every lease, every debt and grant and marriage treaty, back 4 generations. And she had found, buried in the reign of Corvain's grandfather, a lease of the mountain passes so absurdly generous and so poorly drafted that whoever held it could, if they chose, close the northern trade routes entirely at their own discretion. Corvain did not know it existed. His stewards did not know it existed. But Seraphine had memorized the reference, and now, through her factors, she bought it, and she held it, and she said nothing. She was assembling a noose from the kingdom's own forgotten rope, and she was in no hurry at all to pull it, because the longer she waited, the more the rot spread, and the more the rot spread, the cheaper the kingdom became, and the more completely. When the moment came, it would be hers. Ambrose watched her work with a mixture of awe and unease, and one night, over the ledgers, he said the thing that had been building in him. Wren. Seraphine. He had begun, gently, to use her true name in private, and it landed on her each time like a hand laid on the old scar. I have never seen anyone do what you are doing, but I have seen men consumed by less. You are buying a dying man's kingdom out from under him, one debt at a time, and you smile when you do it. And I don't know whether I am watching the finest strategist I've ever met, or someone walking willingly into a fire. Seraphine set down the ledger and looked at him for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice was low and even. I am not doing this to burn him, Ambrose. If I wanted him to burn, I would have stayed. I would have screamed in that corridor and let him see me break, and he would have soothed me and pensioned me off and gone on exactly as he pleased, and in 10 years I would be a bitter old woman in a cottage he calls generous, telling anyone who'll listen how I was wronged. She shook her head slowly. I am doing this because he taught the whole world that I was worthless, and I intend to correct the record. Not with a speech, with arithmetic. When this is done, he will not owe me an apology. He will owe me his crown, his tolls, his grain, and the roof over his head, and he will know, down to the last copper, exactly whom he owes it to. That is not revenge, Ambrose. That is a receipt. He was quiet. Then, softly. And when it's done, when you hold all of it, what then? And Seraphine, who had not let herself think that far, found that the answer was already there, waiting, plain and clear. Then I choose, she said. For the first time in my life, I choose. Whether to keep it, or give it back, or let it fall. But the choosing will be mine, and no man will ever make it for me again. Ambrose reached across the ledger and laid his broad, salt-roughened hand over hers, and she let it stay, and neither of them spoke, and outside the rain came down on the sleeping city that had no idea it harbored a queen. Word from the north grew steadily worse through the turning of the season. The blight deepened. 2 of the great bonded families of High Fen collapsed entirely, their bonds sickening and snapping until the surviving members simply faded, moon-touched and grieving, into their beds. Lysa, the beautiful decorative queen, had lost the child she carried, the very heir whose promise had justified the whole betrayal, and had lost with it what little standing she had, and the whispers said that Ravenna of the Vale no longer troubled to consult the king at all, but ruled through his name as a puppeteer rules a doll, hollowing out the treasury of Hyphen and shipping its wealth quietly south to the Silvered Vale, which had, it now became horribly clear, never wanted an alliance at all. It had wanted a conquest, and it had used a beautiful girl and a proud king's vanity as its blade. Seraphine listened to all of it, and she felt the old grief for the innocent, and she moved faster. Because now it was not only Corvaine's ruin she was engineering, it was, potentially, a whole people's rescue from a predator that had crawled in through the door Corvaine himself had opened. The realization sharpened her purpose into something almost holy. She was not merely buying a kingdom. She was preparing to reclaim one, and to cut out of it the rot that a foolish king had invited to his table. She went to the barge captains, and, instead of abandoning the northern runs, she quietly reopened them under other names, moving grain north at cost, keeping the mountain villages fed through the failing winter. And she did it invisibly, so that the starving folk of Hyphen never knew that the grain keeping their children alive came from the hand of the queen their king had thrown away. Maren would have understood. Mercy given in silence, so that the giving cost the taker nothing in pride. It was the opposite of everything Corvaine had ever done, and it was, Seraphine understood, the deepest revenge of all. To be, quietly and provably, the better ruler, before she had ever claimed a single throne. The endgame arrived not with a summons but with a supplicant, exactly as such things do. It was late autumn, the river running high and grey, when Seraphine's chief factor sent word that a delegation had come to Marrowgate from the north, from Hyphen itself, seeking an audience with the mysterious mercantile power that had, over the past half-year, come to hold nearly every debt and charter and toll that kept the northern kingdom breathing. They did not know her name. They knew only the name of her trading house, the Wren Concern, and they came, cap in hand, because the kingdom was days from insolvency, and the Wren Concern held its throat in one quiet fist. Seraphine received the news in the warehouse office and felt her heart perform a single hard, painful beat, and then go still and cold and clear. "Who leads the delegation?" she asked. The factor consulted his slate. "Their steward and 2 of the Vale nobles, and," he added, "the king himself, Alpha King Corvaine of Hyphen. He came in person. They say he insisted. Of course he did. Even ruined, even hollowed, even reduced to begging a merchant house for his kingdom's survival, Corvain could not imagine sending anyone but himself, because Corvain had never in his life conceived of a room he could not command by walking into it. Seraphine folded her hands on the ledger and looked out at the grey river, and she thought of a corridor and a laugh, and she said, "Tell them the Wren concern will receive them at midday tomorrow. Tell them nothing else. Not my name. Not my face. Let the King of Hyphen wait in a merchant's antechamber, as I once waited in his corridors." The factor bowed and went, and Seraphine sat alone a long while with the grey light on her hands, and she did not gloat, because gloating was a thing you did when the outcome was still in doubt, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. She had spent 6 months making certain of that. She dressed carefully the next morning, and the care was itself a kind of message, though only she would read it. Not in silks, not in jewels, not in anything that spoke of the crown she had returned to its stand, or the finery she had left hanging in a wardrobe 100 leagues away. She dressed as Wren, as the merchant she had become, in fine dark wool without ornament, in a plain collar, in Maren's river silver gild ring on her right hand, and no ring at all on her left. She wore her hair pulled back severe and simple. When she looked at herself in the water-spotted glass, she saw a woman a stranger would take for a prosperous, unremarkable trader, and she understood with a cold satisfaction that this was the truest disguise of all, because Corvain had never once in 6 years looked at her and seen a person of consequence, and so the person of consequence she had become was the last thing on earth he would expect to find waiting in that chair. The receiving room of the Wren concern was long and high and austere, a converted upper floor of her first warehouse, its tall windows giving on to the grey sweep of the river and the masts of the barge line she owned. There was a long table of dark oak. There was a single great chair at its head, turned now to face the window, so that its occupant showed only a straight dark back to the door. And there were, arranged along the table's length in a neat and pitiless row, the documents, the grain debts, the shipping charters, the toll leases, the forgotten mountain pass grant, every last instrument of High Fen's survival, laid out like surgical tools before an operation. Seraphine sat in the great chair with her back to the door, and her hands folded in her lap, and Ambrose standing quiet at her right shoulder, and she waited, and she listened to the sounds of the delegation arriving below, the boots on the stair, the low, anxious voices, and then the door opening, and then the particular heavy tread that she would have known in the dark after 100 years, the tread of the man who had once shared her bed and sworn her his soul and marked another woman while she carried the weight of his kingdom. "We are grateful," said a thin, nervous voice, the steward, "that the Wren concern has agreed to receive us. His Majesty has come a great distance in the hope of reaching an arrangement." Silence. The chair did not turn. Then a second voice, and this one she felt in the old scar on her shoulder before she felt it anywhere else, low and roughened by strain, but unmistakably his, unmistakably Corvain, though thinner now, frayed at the edges where once it had been iron. "I have not come to plead," said the Alpha King of Hyphen, and even ruined, even begging, he could not keep the reflexive command out of it. "I have come to negotiate as one power to another. I am told your house holds certain debts of my realm. I am prepared to discuss terms of repayment, but I will not conduct business with the back of a chair. Turn and face me, merchant, and we will speak as equals." And Seraphine, in the stillness of that grey room, smiled the smile that had no warmth in it, and she said, in her own voice, her true voice, the voice she had not used with him in 6 long months. Equals. She let the word settle. She let it land in the room like a stone into deep water, and she felt, without seeing, the exact moment it reached him, the sharp, indrawn breath, the sudden, impossible stillness. That is a curious word for you to reach for, Corvain. You were never over fond of it before. And then she turned the chair. She would remember his face for the rest of her life, and she would never once regret the memory. She watched the recognition arrive in stages, the way she had watched him betray her in stages through a half-open door. First the confusion, the mind refusing the evidence of the eyes, because this woman was a merchant, a stranger, dressed in dark wool in a river city 100 leagues from his mountains, and could not possibly be. Then the terrible dawning, the colour draining from his face until he was grey as the light, as the river, as the dead grain of his failing fields. Then the phantom flinch of his hand toward his own shoulder, toward the place where his first mark had been, the mark he had cauterized and replaced, as though the sight of her had reawakened a wound he had told himself long ago had healed. "Seraphine," he said, and her name came out of him, broken, a whisper, a prayer, an accusation, all at once. "You are dead. They said you were gone. They searched the river. They said a great many things," she answered, calm as still water. "You told them I would understand my place. You were right. I understood it perfectly. It simply was not the place you had chosen for me." Behind him, the 2 Vale nobles had gone very still, and the steward looked from king to merchant with the dawning horror of a man who has just realized the ground beneath his feet is not ground at all, but ice, and thin. One of the nobles, a sharp-faced woman with silver threaded through her dark braids, spoke, and Seraphine knew, before the factor confirmed it, that this was Ravenna of the Vale, the true hand behind the ruin, the wolf who hunted wolves. "Your Majesty," Ravenna said, smooth and quick, already recalculating, "whoever this woman claims to be, our purpose here is the debt. Sentiment is a luxury Hyphen cannot presently afford. Let us keep to the numbers." And Seraphine turned her cold, clear gaze on Ravenna, and felt something almost like gratitude, because Ravenna, at least, was a worthy opponent, a real one, and dealing with her would be clean in a way that dealing with Corvain could never be. "The numbers," Seraphine agreed. "Yes, let us keep to the numbers. I find them far more honest than anything else in this room." She laid one hand flat on the row of documents. "You have come to negotiate terms of repayment. Let me save us all a great deal of time. There will be no repayment, because there is nothing left in Hyphen's treasury to repay with. I know this, because I have spent 6 months watching Ravenna of the Vale ship that treasury south into her own vaults, a little more with every failing month, while your king mistook her for an ally, and your queen wept over a cradle that would never be filled." She watched Corvain's head turn, slowly toward Ravenna, watched the first crack of doubt open in a face that had trusted the wrong people all the way to the edge of the abyss. "You did not know," Seraphine said softly, almost gently. "Of course you did not. You never knew anything you did not wish to know. It was always your great gift and your great ruin." "That is a slander," Ravenna said, but her voice had thinned, and she had gone still in the particular way of a predator that has just heard a larger predator move in the brush. Seraphine ignored her. She lifted a single document from the end of the row, the oldest and dustiest of them all, the forgotten lease of the mountain passes, and she held it up so the grey light fell through the old vellum. "Do you know what this is, Corvain?" "No." "You never read it?" Your grandfather signed it drunk, I suspect, or careless, and it passed down through your archive gathering dust while you gathered mates. It is the grant of the northern passes. And it is written so badly, so generously, so completely without the caution a wiser king would have demanded, that whoever holds it holds the sole discretion to open or close every trade route into and out of Hyphen. Grain, salt, medicine, the barges that even now are the only thing keeping your mountain villages from starving through the winter. She set it down precisely on top of the others. I hold it. I bought it 11 weeks ago from a broker who did not know what it was. Which means, Corvain, that the food in your people's mouths, the very survival of the kingdom you traded me to strengthen, exists at this moment entirely at my discretion. Not yours. Not hers. Mine. The silence that followed had a texture, thick and cold. Corvain sank, very slowly, into the chair at the near end of the long table, as though his legs had simply stopped consenting to hold him, and he stared at the row of documents, at the whole anatomy of his ruin laid out in her steady merchant's hand, and Seraphine saw the enormity of it arrive in him at last, the full and unbearable weight of what he had done, and what it had cost, not only him, but every soul under his mountains. You have been feeding them, he said, hollow. The grain that came north these past months at cost that the stewards could not account for. That was you. That was me, she said. I fed the children of the man who told me I was a placeholder, and I did it in silence, so that no one would thank me, because I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because I am, as it turns out, the sort of person who feeds starving children even when their father broke something in me that will ache until I die. You never understood that about me either. You thought loyalty and worth were things you granted, like coin, like a title, like a warm body until something better came. You never once considered that the woman beside you might be worth more than the alliance you traded her for. And now you sit in a merchant's chair 100 leagues from your throne, and you beg, and the person you beg is the very person you threw into the river and told to understand her place. It was Ravenna who broke, because Ravenna understood arithmetic, and Ravenna could see, 3 columns deep, exactly how this ledger balanced. She rose, smoothing her skirts with hands that had begun, very slightly, to shake. Whatever arrangement you have engineered, madam, it need not concern the Silvered Veil. Our interest in Hyphen was always provisional. I am certain we can withdraw our involvement and leave you and His Majesty to settle your personal history. She had already half-turned toward the door, already calculating the road south, the vaults full of Hyphen's stolen wealth, the beautiful, foolish niece she would abandon without a second thought. And Seraphine let her take exactly 2 steps before she spoke, and her voice was quiet, and it stopped Ravenna as surely as a hand on the throat. The tolls on the Southern River Road, Seraphine said, the road by which the Silvered Veil carries every ounce of goods it trades with the river cities, including the wealth you have spent 6 months stealing out of Hyphen, are held under charter by the Marrowgate Merchant Consortium. I sit on that consortium. I have, in fact, spent a good deal of the profit from this venture buying my colleagues' goodwill. If I raise my hand in the consortium hall tomorrow, the Silvered Veil's goods sit and rot on the southern road, and every coin you have stolen becomes worth precisely nothing, because stolen wealth you cannot move is not wealth at all. It is ballast. She smiled, and this time there was something almost like pity in it, the pity of the strong for the merely clever. You are not withdrawing anywhere, Ravenna of the Vale. You are exactly where I have spent half a year arranging for you to stand. And there is a magistrate of the river cities, an honest one, who has for some time been very curious about certain accounts. I think he would find your ledgers illuminating. Sit down. Ravenna sat down. It was the only wise thing she did in that room, and she did it slowly, the sharp face gone slack with the particular fury of the trapped, and Seraphine turned back to Corvain, who had not moved, who sat staring at her, as though he had never, in 6 years of marriage, seen her face until this moment, which, she reflected, was probably the truth. You want to know what I am going to do, she said. So do they. So does everyone who has bled under this arrangement. Let me tell you. She rose from the great chair and stood at the head of the table with the grey river light behind her, and she was not tall, and she wore no crown and no jewels and no mark of any king's claim, and she had never in her life looked more like a queen. I am going to forgive the debts of High Fen, all of them. The grain, the charters, the tolls, the paper that even now holds your kingdom's throat. I am going to release the mountain passes to a trust administered by the Healers' Guild, so that no king and no merchant, including me, can ever again hold a people's food hostage to a grudge or a whim. The grain will keep flowing. The villages will not starve. Your people will live, Corvain, and they will not know they were saved, and they will go on speaking your name with a loyalty you did nothing whatsoever to deserve. Corvain's face, which had braced for ruin, cracked open now into something worse, because mercy from the woman he had wronged was a heavier weight than any vengeance she could have chosen. Why? He said, and it was the same word Seraphine had asked Maren at the postern gate half a year and a lifetime ago. Why would you do that? After what I... Because they are innocent, she said simply. And because I discovered, on the night you decided I was furniture, that I would rather be the sort of person who saves a kingdom than the sort who lets it fall to spite the one fool who ruined it. You made me smaller than I was, Corvain, for 6 years. I have spent 6 months becoming larger than you could ever imagine. And the final proof of that, the thing you will lie awake with for the rest of your failing life, is that I am strong enough now to be merciful. And you were never, not for 1 day of your reign, strong enough to be kind. She let that sit. Then she picked up the last remaining document at her end of the table, a fresh one, drawn up that morning in her own clean hand, and she slid it down the oak toward him, and it came to rest before him with a soft and final sound. There is one condition, she said. One. Ravenna of the Vale, and every soul who came south with her, will answer to the magistrate of the river cities for the theft of High Fen's treasury. You will testify. You will hand her over. And you will abdicate. Corvain's head came up. The pack cannot survive without an alpha, he began, the reflex of a lifetime, and Seraphine cut through it like a blade through wet reed. The pack cannot survive with you. Your bond is broken, Corvain. The second mark cursed it, and the curse is in the grain and the wombs and the very moon bonds that make your people a pack. That is not politics. That is old law, and you cannot buy your way past it or command it to be otherwise. The rot began the night you spurned the mate the moon chose, and it will not lift while you sit the throne. You know this. Maren told you, and you called her a jealous old woman. She was neither. She saw the name land on him, saw him flinch, saw him understand at last that the old healer had known everything and warned him and been ignored. Abdicate. Name a regent from among the honest families, one the guild will vouch for. Let the bonds heal in the absence of the wound that broke them, and go somewhere quiet and live a small life, and think every single day about the woman you called a placeholder, and about the fact that she is the only reason your name is not a curse spat over empty graves. He signed it. There was, in the end, nothing else he could do, and some small buried remnant of the man he might have been made him do it without further argument. Made him take the pen and set his name to his own abdication in a merchant's warehouse 100 leagues from the throne he had ruined, while the river ran grey outside, and the woman he had betrayed watched with dry eyes and a still face. When it was done, he set down the pen and looked at her, and for one moment the crumbling arrogance fell entirely away, and there was only the man beneath, hollowed and grieving, and far, far too late. "I loved you," he said. "In whatever way I was able. I want you to know that it was real, once. Before, I know it was," Seraphine said, and her voice, for the first time, held something that was not quite gentleness, but was next to it. "That is the tragedy, Corvain. Not that you never loved me. That you did, and you traded it anyway, for a crown's worth of vanity, and an alliance that was a knife the whole time. You had something the moon herself had chosen, and you could not see it because you were too busy being a king to notice you were also a fool. I am not going to hate you. Maren told me not to spend my years on it, and she was right, but I am never going to see you again after today. And you are going to live a long time, and you are going to know exactly what you threw away. That is not my cruelty. That is only arithmetic. You did the sum yourself. I have merely handed you the receipt." The magistrate's men were waiting below, because Seraphine arranged nothing by halves, and Ravenna of the Vale went out of the Wren concern in irons and in silence, her sharp face frozen in the particular disbelief of a predator who has spent her whole life being the largest thing in the room and has just, fatally, met something larger. The Vale nobles went with her, and Corvain, the last Alpha King of Hyphen, walked out into the grey river after noon, a private man, uncrowned, unmade, carrying with him a document that saved his people and an understanding that would haunt him to the end of his days. And he did not look back at the warehouse, and Seraphine did not watch him go. She had watched enough of him leave, in her time. She was finished with watching men walk away. When the room was empty of everyone but the two of them, Ambrose let out a long breath, the breath of a man who has been holding still through an earthquake, and he came around the table and stood before her, and he looked at her with those river-grey eyes, as though seeing her wholly for the first time. And perhaps he was. "You never told me," he said quietly, "that you were a queen." "I wasn't," Seraphine said. "I was a placeholder. He told me so himself. I have spent 6 months discovering what I actually am, and I find I like her a great deal better." She looked at the long table, at the abandoned documents, at the grey light and the masts of the barges she owned, and she felt the old scar on her shoulder ache once, gently, the way an old wound aches when the weather turns, and then go quiet. It would always be there. She had made her peace with that. Some things do not heal. They simply become part of the architecture, load-bearing, holding up the roof of the person you had to become. "It's done, then," Ambrose said. "It's done," she agreed. And then, because she was, above all things, a woman who chose, she reached out and took his broad, salt-roughened hand in both of hers, and she held it, and she did not let go. She wrote to Maren that night, a long letter by lamplight, and she told the old healer everything, the chair turn and the documents, and the abdication, and the trust that would hold the mountain passes safe forever from the greed of kings. And she signed it, not Wren and not Seraphine the Queen, but simply Seraphine, her own name, hers alone, unqualified by any man's crown or claim. The reply came 3 weeks later, in a hand grown shaky with age, but sharp as ever in its wit. Corvain's abdication had already begun to work. The blight in the northern grain had eased with the spring planting. 2 of the sickening bonded pairs had steadied. A child had been born whole and howling in the village below the keep, the first in half a year, and the midwives were calling it a sign that the moon had turned her face back toward Hyphen at last. The curse was lifting, as Seraphine had known it would, now that the wound at the heart of the pack had been removed from the throne. And at the bottom, in a postscript, Maren had written the words that Seraphine would keep folded in her satchel for the rest of her life, next to the plain river silver ring. You did not fly to spite him, little queen. You flew because you had wings, and he was too small a man to see them. I am old, and I have watched a great many powerful men fall, and I have never once been prouder to have opened a gate. Seraphine did not return to Hyphen. There was nothing there for her but graves and grievances, and she had spent enough of her life in rooms that another person had chosen. She stayed in Marrowgate, where the river ran grey and clean, and the barges she owned went out at dawn and came home at dusk, and she grew the Wren concern into a house that spanned 4 cities, and she never took a title again, because she had learned the deepest truth of the whole bitter business, which was that a title is a leash with a jewel on the collar, and that real power is the kind no one can grant you, and no one can take away, the kind you build with your own hands, out of competence and patience, and the refusal to break when a stronger creature tells you that you are worthless. She married Ambrose Kettering the following autumn, in a plain ceremony by the water with no crowns and no marks and no old blood, and when he took her hand and swore to value her, not for what she had been, but for who she had made herself, she believed him, because he had proven it 100 times over, in the small, unwitnessed ways that matter more than any oath sworn to the moon. She thought of Corvain sometimes, in the years that followed, not with hatred, and not with longing, but with the distant, dispassionate regard one gives a storm that has passed out to sea. She heard once that he lived alone in a fishing village on the western coast, that he kept to himself, that he mended nets for the local men, and spoke little, and was known there simply as a quiet grey stranger who had once, people said, been someone. She heard that he never took another mate, that the second mark had left him as scarred as it had left her, that he sat sometimes on the shingle looking east toward the mountains he had ruined and been saved from ruining, and that he was, by every account, a man who had learned, far too late, exactly what a thing was worth by the size of the hole it left. She did not go to him. She did not write. She had given him mercy, which was more than he had earned, and mercy given and then revisited becomes something smaller, a bid for gratitude, and Seraphine had no more use for gratitude than she had for crowns. She had said everything she needed to say in a grey room with the river at her back and her name in her own mouth. The rest was his to carry. She had set it down, and so the story ends where all such stories end, not with a scream in a corridor, but with a woman at a window in a city she built, watching her barges come home. She had walked out of a palace with nothing anyone had given her, and everything she had made herself, and she had let a king's kingdom fall into her open hand. And then, when it was hers, she had chosen not to close her fist, but to open it, because that, in the end, was the whole of the lesson, the thing the powerful never learn until the ground is taken out from under them, that worth is not granted by those who sit above you, and it cannot be traded away by them either, no matter how loudly they insist. It is proven, quietly, in the dark, on the long road east, in the loosened panel and the hidden coin and the patient half-year of arithmetic. It is built, not inherited. It is claimed, not given. And loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that holds up a roof, cannot be bought with a title or replaced with a second mark. And any man who tries will wake one day to find the roof gone and the walls fallen and the woman he called furniture standing free and whole in the wreckage he made, not looking back. So if this story reached something in you, if you felt the cold snap of that broken bond, and then the slow, warm rise of a woman becoming exactly who she was always meant to be, take a moment before you go. If Seraphine's climb from a discarded queen to a woman no one could command moved you even a little, give this video a like, because it genuinely helps stories like hers find the people who need them. Share it with someone in your life who has been made to feel like a placeholder, someone who needs the reminder that the ground they stand on can be theirs, that leaving with dignity is not losing, that the quiet ones are so often the strong ones. Subscribe and join us here, because this is a place for exactly this kind of story, the slow burn triumphs and the earned reversals, and the ordinary people who turn out to be extraordinary when the world finally gives them no other choice. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew Seraphine was going to win? The corridor, the loosened panel, or the slow turn of that chair? I read every one, and I would love to know which beat you felt in your own chest.